What's the difference between PTSD and cPTSD? Actually, this is a really complicated and controversial topic, so I'm going to try to break it down as a psychiatrist. First off, let's define the terms. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. The C is supposed to add complex. So complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This is where things start to get a bit difficult. Because cPTSD is not in the DSM-5 or the DSM-5-TR, what people are referring to when they bring up that C is a little bit different. Probably the most common conception is persistent mood difficulties, persistent feelings of worthlessness, and interpersonal difficulties. Other times I've heard people use the term when they're describing symptoms of a trauma spectrum illness that include parapsychotic phenomena, which I've discussed in a separate video previously, or other transdiagnostic vague symptomatology that isn't core to the PTSD cluster. But wait, there's more. Some people use the C to refer to chronic, and now it's not complex PTSD, it's chronic PTSD. The chronic itself divides into two conceptions, one of them being that the symptomatology is really chronic and persistent in a person's life after the condition develops. The other framing of chronic is that the exposure, the trauma, rather than being one really big bad incident, was something that was cumulative over time, over many years. So the question is, for me as a psychiatrist, how do I interact with this when people are bringing it to me, meaning so many different things? I'm going to actually make it a little bit more controversial and say that I don't particularly like any of these diagnoses. Instead, I think about this in a first principles neuropsychiatric kind of a way. First, I think about the exposure or the trauma, whether it was chronic or a single moment. Whatever it was something that was overwhelming to the neurocognitive systems of the individual. The brain wasn't able to make sense of it and process it, and so there were these fight or flight responses that went on full 11 out of 10. Then over time, those responses generalized to different contexts, whether that's the veteran jumping when they hear fireworks because it reminds them of gunfire and bombs, or the victim of an assault remembering the scent that was happening at the time and dissociating when they're walking through a Macy's aisle. But going back to the emotional dysregulation we spoke about in the definition of cPTSD, sometimes it's just that the person was exposed to very irregular, erratic, or unsafe environments as a child. So their brain grew up processing emotion in a very erratic way that it couldn't settle into a certain pattern. So the emotional dysregulation, reactivity, and interpersonal difficulties perpetuate. When I'm making a trauma spectrum diagnosis, I take a very rigorous developmental history and try to understand the whole story of the person. Then they and I together come up with a conception of what they feel good calling it. Then on the back end, I map it to the DSM-5 or whatever, the ICD-10, and I explain to them that I'm putting this diagnosis in your chart because it's the closest evidence-based scientific thing we have to assign a name to it. But your individual course of a trauma spectrum illness is yours, and the treatment is also yours. It has to be individualized. There's a lot more to it, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the comments and in upcoming videos. Thank you for helping me destigmatize these topics and make it easier for people to discuss. As always, I look forward to learning from you.